In this tutorial here, we're going to look at playing around with the brush tool and trying to get into some digital painting. But first, what I feel is important is to learn about the actual tool that we're going to be using. And right here, we're going to find that brush tool. And I'm going to just show you the different types of things we could do with the brush tool, even with the control panel. And then we're going to look at brush settings in another video. But for now, I'm just going to play around with this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start a new layer. And I'm just going to play around with the brush tool. So there are a few different brushes, tools, pencil tool, color replacement tool, mixer brush tool, but we're going to focus on the brush tool right now. And we're going to look at a bunch of different brushes that come by default, and then a bunch that we can get, especially if you have your Adobe CC license. You can have access to a lot more brushes, which is really, really great. So what I want to do first, I want to focus on some of the keyboard shortcuts we could use is our bracket key, our left bracket and right bracket. Left bracket makes it smaller, right bracket makes it larger. Okay, so we could just click around with those, or of course, you could just go to the top here and click on your drop down, and we have some options here. We can change the size right here, as big as we want, as big as it can go, and we can change our hardness and softness, but I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Also, we have access to a bunch of default brushes, or all your brushes you have in general. We could just show all those. But right now I'm just going to go to general brushes and just look at some of the ones we have here. Soft, hard, soft, round, pressure. So if you have a Wacom tablet or a stylus with any other type of tablet, you can have pressure sensitive ones, which is really good to use. You get far more control, like a real brush. If you press down hard, you get more. If you press down lighter, you get a little less. A lot of pressure sensitivity, but for most part, I'm just going to play around as if I just had a mouse, because that's our basic that we have. Not everyone has a Wacom or a stylus, but either way, we can do this just here. Also, you can play around with the angle here. We're going to look at the angle in just a little bit. But you can play around with the angle and also the rotation, how thick, thin, the roundness of your brush, I should say, and the angle of your brush. So we could really change things up in how we do that. But like I said, I'll look at that in just a little bit. Okay, so right off, we're going to look at just playing around with a normal soft brush, but I'm going to play around with a hard brush and just the size of it. So if I zoom in here just a little bit, I'm going to play around with the size. So I'm just going to have my foreground color, which is the color that it will be painted. So if I want to change it, I could double click, I go to my color panel, or which has the color wheel on it, which is great. Or I can go to my swatch panel. If I already had some swatches set up, I can choose color that way. But whatever your foreground color is the color that is going to be painted. So for now, let me just play around with a certain color here. I'll just go like that. I'm fine with that. I'll say okay. So I'm just going to paint, and with my soft brush as I paint, oh, I still have my symmetry on right now. I want to get rid of that. I'll show you that later. So if I just paint, that's what comes out as a soft brush. Now that's the size. If I increase the size of it by clicking on my right bracket, I'm making it bigger, or I could right click and change the size here, or I can go up here and change the size here. It's entirely up to you, however you want to do it. I'm going to click again, and there I go. Now what I should do right off at the top, I should have made everything 100% because I'm going to go through those later. But at the opacity and the flow is a little bit lower, that's okay. But here's 100% of what that looks like. And once again, I can make it smaller. Very nice. And that's what I'm looking at. If I streak down, hold down shift, you could also make these perfectly straight lines. And I could play around with this as well. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Okay, and I'm also now going to try a hard brush. So now the hard brush, which I'm going to look at a little bit later as well, is that same idea. It's got a hard edge stroke. There's no feathering, and that's how it actually works. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the hard and soft. So the size you can make as big as you want, as small as you want. If you zoom in to take a sign, to get a sense of how big it is. If you really want fine details, obviously a smaller brush. If you want to cover larger areas, obviously a bigger brush. Now I'm going to get to the hard and soft, which we kind of just discussed. So I have my hardness level here. If I bring my hardness level all the way up, I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. I can do that, and I could paint, and I have that really, really hard edge. Now, also, I can make it all the way soft, and I have far more of a feathered edge. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I have a far more of a feathered edge, so it's softer, so there'll be some nice blending we can get into there too. But I could also just marry it in between and find an area that I like that might work out a little bit better, a little bit hard, a little bit soft, not too much. So there's a little bit of play around with that as well. And if I make it a little bit smaller, same idea. If I make it a little bit harder, that's how it paints. Actually, I won't go all the way, I'll just go some of the way, 80%. Okay, so you can definitely see a difference as we zoom in at the feathering on the edge there. Okay, that is how hard or soft, the control of that. Now the opacity. So I'm going to stick to a hard brush and I'm going to play around with the opacity. I have the flow is still at 100%, the smoothing is 0. I'm going to go to those in just a second because you have so many things that could change your brush. This is kind of interesting where if I was at an art store and I had access to any brush I wanted, this is kind of that idea. You could change up your brush, your tips, so many different things and have all these different brushes at your in your toolbox that you can use pull out right away with subtle tiny little changes. So the next one I'm going to play around with the opacity. So right now it's at 100%. I get that, that's what happens. If I bring it down even just a little bit, let's say to 80%, what I get obviously is 80%, and it's only going to get to 80% of that. Okay, I can click and continue to click. Well, now it gets to 100%, but my initial brush stroke is 80%. If I bring it down even more, let's go to 10%. I can slowly build on top of that. By my initial brush stroke, I'm not letting go. My initial brush stroke will only give me 80%. When I let go of that brush stroke, that click, and I click on it again, well, I'm building again with only 9%, well, 9%. And if I let go again, I'm building again. And I could build up to 100%. If I just continue to click, I'll have to click obviously 10 times to get to 100%. And there's my 100%. That's how we build up slowly but surely with a low opacity brush. Okay, so there is that play as well. I'm going to make my brush size a little bit bigger and we're going to go into flow. I'm going to bring my opacity up to 100% again, but I'm going to bring my flow right now at 100%. That is what I get. If I bring my flow down, let's go to 3%, we start to see a little bit of a change here. What it's doing, it's having controlling how much paint is on the brush. So there's very little paint on this brush. And what it's doing, it's actually how the little circles, because this is one individual circle, how the circles are actually duplicating and going across and coming across there. Now, once again, if I flow and I go over top of it, I can make more build up and build up and build up and continue to do that. If I just bring my flow up a little bit more, now I have more paint that's coming out and more, and I could paint and paint. Now if I bring my opacity down to say 50%, I can brush and brush, and that's all I get. I get 20% flow, 50% opacity, then I could build up again and continue to build. And you start to see the little circles there that are making up my low flow. And I could build and build and continue to build and continue to build. If I go up even higher, 75%, I get even more flow, but you can still see there's a little bit of trailing there, and I can build and build and build on top of that to get to 100%. Now here's a little extra option on the side. It's enable airbrush style build-up effect. So build-up. Build-up is another important part of it. It's actually over here, build-up, is a way to work like an airbrush or not work like an airbrush. So if I bring this down a little bit, but I'm going to bring my opacity up. Let's see how this one works. I'm just going to brush. I'm going to make a bigger brush. And I'm just going to click once without the airbrush being on. I'm just going to click. Airbrush is not on, and that is what I get. I'm going to click the airbrush on. Now let's see what I get. What happened was it will slowly build up. So let me bring my opacity down. And my flow's there. If I click once, that's all I get. If I continue to hold my click down with the airbrush effect, what it does, it builds and builds and builds. Let me bring down my flow even more if it has a better chance of showing. See how it slowly builds by me clicking it down? It slowly builds on top. If I get rid of the airbrush, it will not build. It only gives you one click of your 80% opacity and 12%, 11% flow. But if I click it on, if I click it and hold down the click, it will slowly build it up as I continue to hold down the click. Okay, that is the airbrush tool that helps us play with the buildup. The smoothing is an interesting one too. Smoothing is by default set at 0%. And what I could do with the smoothing, I'm going to bring my flow up again and my opacity up again. And just to play around with the smoothing is kind of interesting because it's just kind of how Photoshop is going to control how much of that smoothing I have. I'm just going to bring my brush down a little bit, and I'm just going to paint like a zigzag way left to right. So I'm just going to paint like this, okay, and go a little faster, and there's my smoothing. It's just, there's zero smoothing, meaning Photoshop is just letting me go to town as far as I want and all that. Now, if I bring my smoothing up to 100%, I'm going to use the same level of stroke, the same width, but watch what happens. I'm going around the same amount, but what Photoshop is doing is controlling that, controlling the smoothing. Now I could say, I don't want the full smooth, but I do want you to smooth a little bit. So I could say maybe 50%, and now the difference in here is I'm going here, it's giving me a little bit extra room to move. So it can control how much, how I smooth my brush stroke. Okay, so now the angle, obviously if we play with the angle, there's a bit of play here. If I click on my angle, I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to move my angle, but well, it's a circle brush, so it's not really going to change much. So what I also need to do is I need to change the roundness of it, and we can see how it changes here too. So I'm changing up the roundness and the angle. So if I click it like this is the angle I get, and that's how it works. Okay, if I now go back and change my angle again to any other way and change up my roundness, I get a different type of brush. Okay, so playing around the angle might assist you in how you want to, how your painting might come across. Now here's an interesting one. I'm going to go back to my original, and I'm just going to play around with the symmetry. Symmetry is very interesting. It's a great little tool you have here in Photoshop. And what I can do is I can play around with my symmetry. So I'm just right now, you can shut it off, which it is off right now. I could go to one I just used, and there's a bunch of different symmetries that I could play with. Vertical, horizontal, dual axis, diagonal, a bunch of different ones. But I'm just going to play with the mandala because it's just an interesting one, and it kind of gives the really good effect of how symmetry works. So what it's going to do, I'm going to click on mandala, and it's going to set up how many segments I want. So I'm just going to, I can't zoom out right now. I'm just going to say I want 7. So I'll say okay. And look what happens here. It sets up a template for me or some guides that I'm going to need. And what I could do, I could leave it right there in the center of my canvas, or I can move it around and I can shrink it down. All right. If I hold down Shift in this situation, I could actually make it unproportional, but in this situation, I don't hold down Shift. And now I could just control it up here. So what I can do, my mandala is there. Once I click off of the brush, obviously it disappears, but once I click back on the brush, it's there again. So I can actually now paint, and I'm going to paint just in one little area here, one triangle, and what is going to happen here happens in all of them. So actually, let me make it even smaller so I get a little bit more detail, and whatever I do will actually symmetrically show up in all my areas, just like that. Very nicely. Okay, so that is the one way to play around with that, and I kind of have some fun with that. But like I said, there are a bunch of different options here, and we could play around with those. But obviously, if you're just painting normally, you don't want to just symmetry off. It will shut it off, and now you're just painting normal again. Okay, so those are the brushes. There is more to brushes and how to play around with them, but that's just your basic on how the brushes work. And I hope that helps you out on how to just get a basic start to using the brushes.